he's been here with a new book, Blood, Fire, and Ice. And it's a historical fiction novel that involves James Creighton. Jim.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being asked to speak here to the Society for International Hockey Research. In fact, it was you guys who sparked my interest in JGA Creighton. When I attended one of your meetings in Toronto, that's when I first heard about him, and I started to investigate him and to learn more about him. And then I started looking into hockey in Halifax and how hockey had developed, and I know there's a huge controversy. You hear about where hockey began, and Bill has his own ideas, and Don Cherry has his own ideas about Kingston, but there's certainly a lot of evidence that hockey may have started in the Nova Scotia area at a very early time. There is certainly evidence for ball and stick games. I quote at the beginning of the book Joe Cope, who said, "Long before the Palefaces strayed to this country, the Mi'kmaq were playing 2 ball games, a field game and an ice game." And I'll have much more information about the fashioning of the Mi'kmaq hockey sticks, because that was one of the 3 threads that caused me to put together Blood, Fire, and Ice. And here's a look at the hockey stick makers. They were the Mi'kmaq people. Some of them are known as Micmac, but they preferred to be called the Mi'kmaq. And this is around 1890 that they were making their. This picture was taken in making their sticks, but of course they made their sticks long before that. And they would make the sticks out of ironwood, which was a particular tree that you could find in the Nova Scotia area. Most of them, I think, are all since long gone. They seem to have carved so many sticks that eventually they disappeared. But they would use the root of the stick for the sticks that they would make, and hence the name ironwood, because they were very strong and very hard to break. And then they would use these small huts for the drying of the sticks. So this idea dovetailed with a third idea that I had, the 3 threads that went together to make the novel. And of course, that first one I talked about, James George Alwyn Creighton, 1850 to 1930, was the inspiration for half of this book, and I would say 50% of the book is devoted to him and his history, and the other half towards Alex Gould, my indigenous Métis character. And this is a look at the Halifax skating rink in 1863. So the story opens in 1862 with Alex getting together with his friend JGA Creighton, and they're young boys, and they've learned how to play hockey out on the harbor. And so James' mother was actually involved with the Garden Society, and they built this indoor hockey rink, and they opened that in the New Year's 1863, and this is an artist's depiction of that rink. And so this may have been where he got the idea of an indoor hockey game. At least that's where I pick it up in my book. And then, of course, I started looking into the history of Star manufacturing, and they are very famous for their Star skates. And perhaps you don't know, but many of you will, as hockey historians, know that the hockey skates back then weren't the booted kind where they were all in one. They in fact were skates that would attach to any boot, or not just any boot, but the thing about Star manufacturing is they developed a spring-loaded skate which could attach to any boot. So it didn't matter what size your boot was, the Star spring-loaded skates would work. And they started developing those in 1863, and they built those Star skates and sold millions of them around the world up until 1939. And this is in fact the factory where the skates were manufactured, and I imagine that the stick making was also associated with that. We know that Creighton later endorsed the Star skates. In And so we know that he probably used them and may have had them shipped to the very famous game in Montreal. And we know he also ordered some sticks. So in my book, I have Alex bring sticks to the game in order for the players to play in that very famous game that took place March 3rd, 1875. So the novel then begins with Alex Gould, the fictionalized Métis character who leaves school and begins to take up work in the factory. And then in the first section, JGA, as I said, for my research shows that he was called JJA by his friend, his friends, not James. He didn't really like James or George because they in fact were the names of his father and his grandfather, who happened to own a company, Creighton and Sons, which was a large, respectable company in Halifax that was in the ship channeling business. So they would provide foodstuffs for sailing boats, and they also had wholesale food that they would sell. And so he did not want to be a part of that, and he decided he was going to pursue his own career. I have it against his father's wishes in the book. In June of that same year of 1864 then, J.G.A. Creighton graduates from Dalhousie College. And yeah, I imagine his father probably didn't like this in the book. By 1865, the fictionalized Alex Gould, having quit the mission school, has joined the factory. His father is a Mi'kmaq stick carver and a blacksmith, and his mother is a jeweler and craft maker. And the ironwood was what made that so famous. But getting back to J.G.A. Creighton, after he graduates, of course, he will move on to Montreal. The Golden Gates to Point Pleasant Park, which are still found in Halifax, were in fact made by Star Manufacturing of Dartmouth. And so we can see how beautiful the work was. So Star Manufacturing wasn't just known for its ironwork, it was also known for its work in gold. And I imagine that Alex is one of the goldsmiths who manufactures these gates, which can still be seen in Halifax. So Alex then divides his time between stick making with his father and working at the factory. And we can see that they did manufacture much more. Then we fast forward to 1868. 1868, and J.G.A. or Creighton has now graduated from Dalhousie College. As one of the top graduates of the college, he's recruited by Sanford Fleming, and later Sir Sanford would go on to standardize time. And J.G.A. begins to work as a surveyor for the Intercolonial Railway, mostly in New Brunswick. And for the Prime Minister of the new country, John A. Macdonald, also shares a vision with Sir Sanford, well, he was Sanford Fleming, later he was knighted, Sanford Fleming, of building a railway right across Canada. And later he will be chosen for this task, but will be displaced by William Van Horn, who was the ruthless railway baron that took over from Sir Sanford Fleming, who was deemed to be not a tough enough man to complete the journey with Macdonald. Thus, J.G.A. begins his engineering career doing survey work for the Intercolonial Railway. In 1873, the novel finds Alex continuing his work in Dartmouth at the factory. Though his artistry with gold and his hard work, he begrudgingly earns the respect of Foreman Forbes and Mr. John Starr. Mr. John Starr is the owner of the factory, and he is the one who hires Alex at the factory. And Foreman Forbes makes an appearance, and he was the inventor, of course, of the Starr skate, and worked for a long time at Star Manufacturing, and was the foreman there. From her diary, we also know that Lady Dufferin, who was wife to the then Governor General Lord Dufferin, both skating enthusiasts, paid a visit to the Star Manufacturing facility in Dartmouth in 1873. And she was presented with a gift of gilded gold skates. And in the novel, of course, I imagine that Alex created those same skates. That same year of 1873, Creighton decides he's had enough of the railway. It's tough work out there in the wilderness, just measuring things and trying to get railway built. So he begins to take up work in Montreal, working on the building of the Lachine Canal. And in the following year, 1874, he joins the McGill rugby team, who go on to play Harvard University in a game of modified rugby football. And it's Creighton's background in rugby that led to some speculation that early hockey might have even been a backwards game. But as I mentioned in the book, I subscribe to the hockey espoused by Ian Fife of the Society, who said that forward passes did in fact take place in early hockey. The central scene in the novel is, of course, the first ever recorded hockey game held on March 3rd, 1875. And we know that Creighton had hockey sticks and probably those spring-loaded skates shipped from Halifax. In my book, Alex brings the skates and the sticks as a salesman for Star Manufacturing. And we can see that this is an artist depiction in Michael McKinley's book, Putting a Roof on Winter, which shows that Victoria skating rink. Originally it was a curling rink, and J.G.A. Creighton decides that he's going to put on a hockey game among McGill students. And so he sells tickets to the game. And the use of the Victoria rink in Montreal was previously used for curling as well as figure skating. So we discovered that J.G.A. Creighton was also a figure skating coach and instructor. Blood, Fire, and Ice describes how Creighton took the time to pound in the metal stakes for the goalposts. Sold between 30 and 40 tickets, and all of the players are part of the public record because an article was published in the Montreal Gazette which tells about the game, as well as another article in the Kingston Whig Standard. Creighton, we know, had a reputation as a skilled defenseman, or in those days they were called a point, and we knew he could handle the puck very well. In the novel, the fictionalized character of Walcott, who was a journalist for the Montreal Gazette, acts as the referee. And the referees in those days were very different from the referees of today. So they would be nattily attired in a top hat. They wouldn't have a whistle, they would have a bell that they would ring back and forth. And he would probably have on a top hat as well as tails, and carry that bell to ring when a goal, actually it was called a game in those days. A game was scored. They weren't using the word goal as far as I could tell. While we don't know who scored, we know that Captain Creighton's team recorded a victory of 2-1. Although the Gazette article makes no mention of it, an article does exist in the Kingston Whig Standard that an on-ice brawl occurred during the game. And of course this was impossible to resist, because I had to have a hockey brawl in my book. And so it's the first ever recorded hockey fight that we know of. Although some dispute the article, it was too good not to include. And you see, Creighton was part of the organizing committee at the Victoria rink, but there was some dissension in the committee that the use of the rink for hockey, including the metal posts that he hammered into the ice, would negatively impact the ice surface of the rink. So it's not a stretch to imagine that a mob, and the article in the Whig Standard reported that a mob did show up later in opposition to the game, and they had to shut the game down early, resulting in the flared tempers and a brawl, which reportedly shocked all the ladies present, according to the writer. Speaking of ladies, it's around this time that J.G.A. or Creighton meets a lady by the name of Eleanor Platt. And in my book, their romance occurs imaginatively when J.G.A. or Elwyn, as she liked to call him, meets Eleanor while acting as her figure skating instructor. Eleanor comes from a very prominent family, and this part is definitely true. For her father was named George, and he was a prominent businessman and a member of the Montreal Board of Trade. So Elwyn courts Eleanor and eventually marries her. My research indicates that the marriage took place not as you would expect from a wealthy family in Montreal, not at the cathedral, but at St. George's Anglican Church in Montreal in 1878. And I examined the church records and discovered who signed off at the marriage license at the Toronto Reference Library. On February 27, 1877, the first rules of hockey were published. And in my novel, I present Creighton as the principal impetus behind the rules themselves. There is some evidence that Creighton was involved in the forming of the rules, but it's never been historically established that he was the man behind the rules. But certainly, some people think that he, in fact, was the impetus behind the publication of the rules in the Montreal Gazette. During his time in Montreal, JGA's interest in engineering begins to wane, and he is drawn to public events and politics and to the legal profession. So he returns to McGill to study law, and after he graduates from McGill in 1880, he is called to the bar. Well, we know that while studying the law, Creighton wrote for the Montreal Gazette from 1870 till 1880. In fact, having read two of his later articles, one about the Quebecois people and the Quebecois countryside, and another that he wrote about the Northwest Mounted Police, I can attest that he was a very fine writer. He also made frequent trips at this time, from 1877 to 1880, to Ottawa, and he learned about the workings of government. And that begins to increase as a member of the Gazette when he is in the press gallery in Ottawa. So in 1881, the young lawyer Creighton is called upon to testify into the inquiry of the killing of his own brother in Montreal. Harry Montgomery was his brother, and he was stabbed in the hand. In my own book, this incident becomes a key but fictionalized part of the plot involving my other major character, Alex Gould. And I'll just read a couple of quotations, one from Edward Stanley, 17th Earl of Derby and founding member of the Ontario Hockey Association. And this is what he had to say about the famous Rideau Rebels. It was in connection with a small group of hockey enthusiasts, of whom 4 or 5, if not more, were members of the staff of my father, Lord Stanley, the Governor General. We formed a team of ourselves, our name, the Rebels. I'm glad to think that from that very small beginning, there has developed the present contest for the Stanley Cup, now the greatest ice hockey contest in North America, and that means the world. And a second quotation comes from, a much more humble one in fact, comes from James George Owen Creighton himself. And this is what he had to say when he was asked about his contribution as a captain, first of that very first team, as well as the captain of the Rideau Rebels. He said simply, "I had the honor to be the captain of the first regular hockey club to be formed in Canada." That's all he said. And that was in a letter he wrote to Henry Ward, who was the mayor of Port Hope. There's that Port Hope connection, a member of Parliament and a fellow Rideau Rebel. And he was also one of the founding members of the Ontario Hockey Association. So on February 27, 1877, then those first rules of hockey were published, and in my novel, Creighton is a part of that. During his time in Montreal, in 1882, Creighton moves to Ottawa, and then he lives in a region of Ottawa known as Sandy Hook. Through the Canada Census, my research indicates that in 1901, he was living there now with his wife Eleanor, her mother, Eleanor Jane, as well as Eleanor's sister Alice, along with a maid. So Sandy Hook is a place in Ottawa, or was a place, and probably still is, where a lot of civil servants lived, and he lived along with them in Sandy Hook. And it's in Ottawa where Creighton takes upon the job as chief clerk of the Senate, where he will work for many years. And he was responsible for the writing of many laws for the various parliaments at this time. He also is asked by the Stanley brothers to join and captained the Rideau Rebels, which are a touring hockey team, very famous touring hockey team. And the famous photo on the cover of my book reflects his brief time with the touring team. Now, Creighton himself was very busy with his Senate work, and so he was, although he played some games with the Rebels in Ottawa, he chose not to take part of the team that toured and went about playing various teams in Lindsay and Toronto and different places around the province. In 1890, at the age of 40, he gives up organized hockey for good, leaving it to the younger players like the Stanley brothers. But he does go on to live to the ripe old age of 80 in 1930. In fact, he dies in 1930, discovered by the doorman to have a heart attack. And now, so I'd like to acknowledge Mr. McKinley for his book, Putting a Roof on Winter. I used a lot of different sources for research for that book. And this book is projected to be one of a pair of books. My second book will be entitled Emperors and Hockey Ghosts, and it will include 4 major characters. So this book was probably 50-50, fictionalized and true. I would say the next one's going to be 80 to 90% true, because the 4 major characters are Conn Smythe, Frederick McLaughlin, who was the founder and the first owner of the Chicago Blackhawks, Max Bentley, who was of course involved in the Wayne Gretzky trade back in its day, that Conn Smythe arranged between the Hawks and the Leafs. And the 4th main character will be Castle. So she is the wife, Irene Castle, sorry, the wife of Frederick McLaughlin. She was a very famous dancer, beautiful woman and dancer, married 4 times. But definitely her life with Freddie was not a friendly one. And I warn you, there's eventually became a very sad and violent relationship. So even though Frederick McLaughlin is in the Hockey Hall of Fame, in fact, he was a wife abuser. So a very, very serious topic. Again, you have people being removed from the Hockey Hall of Fame. Nothing's been said about Frederick McLaughlin. So it's a double-edged sword, because the book tries to be humorous, but that of course is a very, very serious matter. And so those 4 characters, and the main focus, of course, will be on Max Bentley and Doug Bentley, the time he spends with the Hawks, making the league as a diminutive forward. Sounds a bit like Mitch Marner, one of my favorite players, 5'4" and 150 pounds, soaking wet. And just, again, before his time, a really great player. So Emperors and Hockey Ghosts, I hope to have that out next fall. Thank you. About 2 or 3 years went into the researching of the question.